you! If you're enjoying the Singing Teachers Talk podcast, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We are committed to bringing you engaging conversations and valuable insights from experts across the field of voice. By subscribing, it means we can continue to do that. You'll never miss an episode, and you'll be helping to spread the word to other singing teachers, vocal coaches, and overall voice nerds. So subscribe to this channel now and just watch your teaching grow. Molly, as someone who has a background in neuroscience, have you ever considered making the slightest and perhaps whimsical tweak to your surname, calling yourself Molly Gebrian instead?
You know, it's funny because that's how a lot of people think my name is pronounced, and they try to spell it that way. Yes, so I have actually thought about that, but I think I'll keep my name.
Yes. Well, Dr. Molly Gebrian, it's lovely to have you on the Singing Teachers Talk podcast. Thank you so much for coming to chat with me today.
Thanks for having me. That was a funny question. I like that.
Firstly, can you help set us up for this talk by taking us on a tour of the brain and some of the other anatomical landmarks that we might want to be familiar with so that we can have some reference points for what we might get onto in a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. It's hard to know what I often in these podcast interviews don't actually talk about specific brain parts. So it'll be interesting to see what we talk about, but just some basic overview on how the brain is organized. The brain is made up of two lobes, right hemisphere and left hemisphere. Each one of those hemispheres has four parts to it. So the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So those are the big sort of organizational divisions in each hemisphere. And within each of those lobes is sort of specialized areas that deal with like language comprehension or auditory things or motor things. One thing about the brain that I think a lot of people don't really think about and don't quite understand is even though there are specific areas of the brain that are in charge of like processing vision or processing things you hear, everybody's brain is slightly different, just like every single one of us has a different face, right? We have the same facial organization. We have two eyes, we have a nose, and we have a mouth, but every single person looks different, right? Because the specific characteristics of our faces are different, even though they have the same parts, and our brains are exactly the same. And so, yes, you can generalize across people just like you can with faces, but everybody's brain is unique, just like everybody's face is unique.
In that sense, when we talk about left hemisphere, right hemisphere, that bit's working then, or your right-sided brain, if that's how we talk. Is there truth in that, or is the brain just always working as one?
The brain is always working as one, assuming the thing that joins the two hemispheres of the brain is called the corpus callosum. It's basically a big information transfer highway, if you want to think of it like that runs like through the middle of your brain. And the only time the two hemispheres don't talk to each other is when the corpus callosum has been cut, which only happens in very, very, very serious cases of epilepsy where they can't do anything else to control seizures, and so they'll cut the corpus callosum. But without that being done, which is 99.99% of people, our brain is always working together. The sort of right brain, left brain thing is definitely an oversimplification and a misnomer. All of us are using all of our brains all the time. There are certain skills that one hemisphere of the brain may be slightly better at than others. So for instance, with language, the main language centers in our brains are housed in the left hemisphere, and there are certain processing capabilities that the left hemisphere does better than the right hemisphere, but that doesn't mean we don't use the right hemisphere to do language processing. It's just different kind of language processing.
Right. So I've got some terms here that I would love to get your definition on. So
Sure.
starting off, neurons. What are neurons?
Great. So neurons are the cells in our brain. That's the sort of global word for them. There's lots of different kinds of neurons that look different and do different things. But the cells in our brains are called neurons, and they have to communicate with each other in order for us to do literally anything at all.
Okay. And the synapse or the synapse?
Yep. In the US we call it the synapse. I do think British people say synapse, right? I'm not sure actually.
We do, yeah, I think we
Um,
do.
yeah, synapse, whatever you want to call it. So the synapse is the tiny little space between two neurons in the brain, and that's where everything happens in terms of communication. And so anytime you want to do literally anything at all, the neurons in your brain have to communicate with each other, and that communication happens across the synapse, that little space between them. And when one neuron wants to pass a message to another neuron, it will spit out neurotransmitter, which is just the umbrella term that we use for the chemicals that our brains use to communicate. So the first neuron will spit neurotransmitter out into the synapse. And on the other side of the synapse is the second neuron. And that neuron has receptors that neurotransmitter can bind to. And once the neurotransmitter binds to those receptors, it causes an electrical change in that second neuron, and that electrical change gets sort of passed down the neuron, passed down what's called the axon. It's like a long arm that sticks out from the neuron. And when that electrical charge gets to the end of the axon, the process repeats itself. So then more chemicals are spit out into the next synapse, bind to the receptors, causes an electrical change in the next synapse, and so on forever. And so it's kind of a chain reaction like that.
What's a neural pathway?
Sure. So a neural pathway is when you have a whole bunch of neurons communicating with each other in order for you to do whatever you want to do. So especially for anything having to do with music, because it's very complicated. Singing, playing an instrument, doesn't matter what it is, it's a complicated thing. And so a lot of neurons have to be talking to each other in order to do whatever you're trying to do musically. And often the language that's used to describe that is a neural pathway, a whole bunch of neurons that communicate so that you can do what you want to do.
And then myelin.
Yes, this feels like a neuroscience vocabulary test. It's very fun. So myelin is, we were just talking about the axon, that long arm of the neuron that sticks out with the electrical signal that goes down it. Myelin is essentially a layer of fat that wraps around that axon, and it allows that electrical signal to move more quickly and more efficiently down the axon. So when you've done something many, many times, the neural pathway that's involved with that skill, the axons have become myelinated. And to you on the outside, it feels very easy to do that thing because the information is traveling very quickly and very efficiently. When you're brand new at learning something, the reason it feels so clunky and awkward and clumsy and like you're like, wow, I'm absolutely terrible at this, is because the neurons involved haven't been myelinated yet. And so they don't communicate very efficiently. And on the outside to you, you just feel like, wow, I'm awful at this.
I just wanted to give you an insight actually to what I did the other day, just to prepare for this podcast, because I was researching these terms on some of your lovely material actually on your website. And to make myself feel much smarter, I went into my husband and got his whiteboard pen out and did him a hangman of some of these terms. And he needed
I
some
love it.
help. And I thought, I can help you with this because I know the answer from today's research.
I love
But
that.
before that, I had no idea. So thank you for clearing that up for us. Uh,
Absolutely.
so can you tell us what is physically happening within the brain when we're learning?
Yeah, I mean, a full answer would take all day, so I'll give a more simple answer. So when we're learning anything or getting better at anything, there are physical changes that have to happen in the brain. And so one of the first things that happens is the neurons on either side of the synapse that we were talking about, they change things about their physical structure to help them communicate more efficiently. So that communication can just be a lot easier. The analogy I use for this, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's like when you put someone in your favorites in your phone, it's much easier to call them. You just go to your favorites and you call them versus having to look them up in your address book in your phone, right? And find them and call them. It's not hard, but it takes a little bit more time. If they're in your favorites, they're just right there. So one of the first things that neurons do is they essentially set up the synapse so it's much easier for them to communicate, just like when you put someone in your favorites in your phone. And that's an actual physical change that has to happen. Another change is the myelin that we just talked about. And yeah, there's a whole host of microscopic, but also larger scale physical changes that go on in the brain when you learn something that essentially makes it easier and more efficient for the neurons involved to communicate with each other. So that again, on the outside to you, it feels easy and smoothless and not a big deal at all.
And is it the same process when we're learning absolutely anything?
Yes, it is. And this is something I think it's important to conceptualize because I think it's kind of easier to think about this in terms of like learning a physical skill, like me as a violist, like learning how to play the viola, or learning like a new language, or learning facts or something like this. But this is also the process that underlies, for instance, the way we talk to ourselves. And so, like, anytime you learn something new and you use the neurons involved, they will get better and better and better at communicating with each other. And that process will get streamlined and it will feel easier and easier and easier. Neuroscientists talk about well-myelinated pathways. It feels very easy to do something when there's a lot of myelin. And you can see how that's beneficial for learning a skill or a language or facts. But it's the same thing with how we talk to ourselves. And so if we are constantly beating up on ourselves and saying, oh, you're so worthless. Oh, you don't know what you're doing. Oh, you're terrible. What's wrong with you? Those pathways get very well myelinated in the brain, and it's very easy to access them. And those thoughts start going automatically, just like when a skill starts going automatically. And so we have to be very careful with our self-talk too, that we aren't myelinating those pathways, because it's not helpful, right, to talk to yourself in that way. And that's also why it can be so difficult to get out of that kind of self-talk, which is not helpful for us as performers, right? When you're on stage, you don't need someone like berating you all the time. But the process of learning to talk to yourself in a more helpful way is exactly the same as the process of learning the skill of singing or playing an instrument or whatever. It's the same exact mechanisms in the brain, which I find very empowering, actually, that like, if there's something about how you're talking to yourself when you're performing that is not helpful for you, you can practice the new skill of talking to yourself in a more helpful way, and it will be exactly the same process you used to learn how to sing or play an instrument in the first place.
I think sometimes because we don't necessarily know when that end point is, we want it now. And we live in
Yeah.
a really fast-paced world, don't we? We can get something at the click of a button. And some singers have described to me how they want to be able to belt right now. I want to find my mix in this lesson and this lesson only. I don't want it to have to be like a weekly or monthly or even yearly thing. How quickly is it actually possible to create a myelinated pathway?
That's a good question that I don't have a good answer for. And also like all of these things differ person to person, like we were talking about with everyone's faces the same but different, same with our brains. Um, and so it's hard to say, well, after 2 weeks or 1 month or whatever, like it'll be in place and everything will be fine, because there's just so many different variables involved. But I think you're absolutely right that like everybody wants everything like now. And it just doesn't happen like that because your brain has to make physical changes, it has to like build things up there. Um, and you can't feel that when that's happening, right? It's not like you can physically feel your brain changing and you can't see it. And so it feels like nothing's happening. What I like to imagine, I don't know why this is my image, but I like to imagine those little minion guys, like the little yellow guys with like the one eye, like running around in my brain, like myelinating things and plugging things together and just like going crazy trying to like hook everything up. And like once they're done with all their work, then everything works and it feels good to me on the outside. But I can't see them running around up there. I can't feel them running around up there. I just have to trust that they're running around up there. And if I stop practicing, for instance, because I'm frustrated, I'm like, oh, I just want to do this now. I can't do this now. Clearly, it's useless. I'm never going to be able to do this. If I say that and then I stop practicing and working towards it, they're standing up there like all dejected, like, well, what do we do now? Like, I haven't given them any more input. They don't know what to do, right? And so I have to keep giving them input and they will continue doing their jobs. And then eventually I will be able to do what I want to do. And I think that sort of, I don't know, trust in the process and that image is really helpful just because you can't feel the improvement and it seems like nothing's happening and it seems like it's really slow is not actually true. There's so much going on up there that you're just not aware of.
Wouldn't it just be really helpful if we could feel it or have
Yes.
something to just
Yes,
say,
like a
hey,
progress
we're doing
bar.
it. Yeah. Like in The
Yeah, like,
Sims. Have you ever played The
yeah,
Sims, the game? They have those
I
little like
haven't, but
bars above their
yeah,
heads, and it's like, so and so's getting to level 5 in logic. I'd love that above my head.
right. No, that would be so unbelievably helpful to have sort of that progress bar. I will say for myself, over the years, I have developed a much better sense of how long something's going to take for me to learn. So I kind of have an internal
Mm.
progress bar. And one of the things that leads to frustration the most for a lot of people in a lot of things, not just music, is having an unrealistic progress bar in their head, where maybe something is going to take you 3 months to really learn and master. And if you could see your progress bar, you could see that after 2 weeks, like you're this far along. But people have in their mind, well, this should only take a week. It's taken me 2 weeks. What's wrong with me? No, actually, it's going to take you 3 months. Nothing's wrong with you. You're great right now. You're right on track. And for me personally, the way that I have developed that sort of internal progress bar that I feel is more accurate than certainly it was when I was like a student is just really paying attention to how long things actually take. They're always going to take longer than you think, like always. And paying attention to that and, making notes about that. Like, okay, this actually took me like 6 months. And so when I was frustrated in week 2, like I was just at the beginning. There's nothing wrong with me that I couldn't do it after 2 weeks because it was a 6 month process. And so now, when something isn't working, I'm able to step back and be like, well, where am I in this progress bar that's in my head? Oh gosh, I'm only a third of the way in. Like, of course I can't do it yet. Okay, it's fine.
Yeah. What makes one person be able to learn something quicker than another? Is there something specific in their brain that some person has more of or less of than the other?
That's another question that I can't really answer very well. I mean, all of us are different, right? As I've said a couple of times right now, and it's not better or worse. Like I'm very tall, I'm 5'10". That doesn't make me better than someone who's short, right? I'm just taller, and so it's going to be much easier for me to reach things that are high up, right? I'm not very physically strong though. So if it's something heavy, I'm going to have trouble with it. Someone who's shorter and stronger will have an easier time picking it up. That doesn't mean they're better than me. It's just different. And it's the same thing with our skills and how quickly we learn. We all have things that come a bit more easily to us. We all have things that we struggle with. And the reason for why we struggle or why something is easy is I don't think anybody could answer that question. It's the brain is just so complicated. And I think it's very easy to feel like if something doesn't come easily to you, especially if you notice in comparison to other people, like, wow, other people can do this really easily. What's wrong with me? I think it's very easy to think if something doesn't come easily to you, therefore all is lost. You can't do it. There's no point in trying, like, oh, well, this isn't for me. And that is so not even close to being true. That's not how the brain works. That's not what research shows about skill development, knowledge development, anything. It just shows that we're all different, that you can do anything you want. If something takes longer for you, that's fine. That's just you, just like anything else. And I think, like for me, I actually learn music really, really slowly. I don't have a good connection between my brain and my body just because I understand what's supposed to be happening with my body. Doesn't mean that I can like put it into action. I have to really work at that. And so I've had to learn that my process is going to take longer than someone else just because that's how my brain works. That's how my body and my brain communicate with each other. And there's nothing wrong with that. I just have to know, back to the progress bar thing. Like my progress bar is longer than someone else's, and that's fine. So I think it comes back to sort of knowing yourself, and
Yeah.
not judging yourself if something is hard for you, because it doesn't matter.
Mm. What does that say then for something like the quick fix? So in singing, we might talk about, okay, you've got a gig in 2 days. We need a quick fix for this, and then we'll come back to it and look at it more long term. Is there such thing as quick fixing something or plugging something in the short term?
It depends on what it is. Certainly, yes, there can be. What comes to mind when you say that is, over the years, I've had a number of adult beginners who, were retired and they always want to play, violin, and so they'll start up. And often, many of them will sort of try to teach themselves for a while, and then they'll reach a point where they feel like, oh, maybe I should get a teacher. And I've seen many times where they're really, really struggling with something and they can't figure out how to do it. And I, as the teacher, can see very easily it's because their elbow is like this when it should be like this, like a very small tweak in where their elbow is. And the minute we move their elbow, instantly their issue is solved. And so that is a very quick fix that, because of my knowledge of the body mechanics around playing, I can see, oh, that's your problem. We'll make this one shift and everything will get fixed. And sometimes it's great when those things happen, right? And it's just like, okay, problem solved. Other times, it is a more sort of long-term process that you can sometimes put something in place in the short term so someone can get through a performance successfully, but there's like underlying issues there that need to be sort of looked at and taken apart and solved for the actual problem to not be there anymore.
I'm just pressing the pause button on the podcast for a very brief moment to invite you to book your free BAST call. If you've been thinking about joining the BAST community through one of our courses, but you just don't know which option is the best for you, then why not book your free Zoom chat with our very own Kimberly George, who has all the answers. Head over to basttraining.com/book-a-call/ and click that big blue button. That's basttraining.com/book-a-call/. Now, where were we?
Yeah.
So how have you figured out how long it takes for you to learn something? And is it the general amount of time, do you think, for any task?
That's a great question. For me, it's been observation over many, many, many years. Like, if I have X amount of time to learn, this repertoire, when I get to the performance, how do I feel? Do I feel like, yep, I'm ready to go, I'm prepared, I can do this? Or do I feel like, oh my God, like, no, I need another month on this. Like, I really feel, and so for me, it's been observation over many, many years and many performances of how I feel when I get to the performance stage. It's also been, in terms of realizing that it takes me more time than other people, it's been observing other people and knowing how much time they had and like, whoa, they only had, like 2 weeks to learn this thing and they seem fine. Like, definitely I couldn't do that. I need more time than this. But it does depend on the task. I would say anything having to do with playing the viola takes me a lot longer than a lot of other things. Most things come really quickly to me, just not playing the viola. And with playing music, I know that something that I have to play very fast, for instance, it's going to take me a lot longer than something that's slow and lyrical. And so depending on the musical challenges, some things take longer than others. But for me, it's been, observation over many years.
And how do you know that thing has actually been learned, insofar that you could put it away for a couple of weeks and come back to it and you can still have it?
Right. So this gets into another whole topic. I don't know if you want me to get into it now, but which is the idea of taking breaks, and the importance of taking breaks for learning things. So this research on taking breaks goes back to the 1880s. Like, it's very, very, very old research, but it is the most counterintuitive thing ever. And it hasn't really come into our consciousness, certainly as musicians. We all tend to think that if you take a break from something, it's going to sort of deteriorate on you, right? And then you come back and it's going to be all rusty and you're going to have to, bring it up from scratch again. But actually what the research on breaks shows is that we make the most progress when we are taking a break, which is the most like confusing, counterintuitive thing ever. But the reason for that is what we were talking about a little bit before, of the reconstruction the brain has to do. So in order to learn anything, like we were saying, the brain has to do physical reconstruction. And in order to do that, it needs you to take a break. So the analogy I use for this is road construction, right? If they need to fix the road for some reason, you can't have cars driving on it at the same time, right? They have to shut down the road, do whatever they need to do to the road, and then open it back up. It's the same thing in our brains. So our brains need us to take a break to do whatever construction it has to do. And then once it's done, when we practice again, we're at a much higher level. And so you can take breaks strategically to take advantage of this fact. And so part of the trust that things will be okay after you take a break is understanding that actually after a break, things are often better than they were before you took a break. That being said, while you're actually practicing, you need to be practicing in such a way that whatever you're working on is going to actually stick with you. And often people practice in such a way that things don't actually stick. And so then you do lose them completely during your break. A prime example of this that is so common in practicing is people will be, wrestling with something that they can't really do very well, and they'll get it right once, and then they'll move on to something else. It's not going to stick with you if you got it wrong a million times and you got it right once. And then when you come back after a break, it's not going to be there because you only got it right once. And so that's sort of a prime example of a bad practice habit that won't serve you well kind of ever, but certainly after a break.
How long is that break, do you advise then?
It completely depends. And so the scientist that discovered this idea that breaks actually improve learning, his name was Ebbinghaus. He was German. This was back in the 1880s. He also discovered something called the forgetting curve. And so basically, when something is brand new, you forget it much more quickly and much more easily, which makes sense, right? You just learned it. The longer you have known something, the longer it takes for you to actually forget it altogether. And so there's sort of this drop off over time. And so what the research shows on taking breaks is that when something is new, your break should be shorter. And then as you get better and better at something, the break should be longer and longer and longer. So it depends on where you are in the learning process in terms of how long your break should be.
To link to that, then, how easy is it to undo an unhelpful habit that may have already become automated because it's been myelinated and it's been wrapped in that sheath?
Right. Yes. Great question. So myelinated pathways are very hard to sort of override because they feel really automatic. The way that myelin works in the brain, once the myelin wraps are on the axon, there's no mechanism that we have to tell the brain to take the myelin away. The myelin is there once it's there. And so you have to make a new pathway and you have to start myelinating sort of the new pathway. One of the things that's so frustrating about bad habits is we often do them without any conscious awareness at all, right? We just do them. And if someone points out, like, I think of like people like biting their nails and they don't want to, they often don't even realize, and someone points out, oh, you're biting your nails. Oh my gosh, I am. Oh my gosh, I didn't even know. And so we do our bad habits mindlessly, also in playing music. And so in order to create a new habit and sort of override the bad habit, you have to make sure that you are always doing your new habit and you're making a conscious choice to do your new habit at all times when you're singing or playing or whatever. And that will help you become more aware of the bad habit so that you don't do it unconsciously. And then there's a very frustrating period of time where you'll maybe do your new habit like 10% of the time, and then 20% of the time. And then over time, you'll do it more and more and more until you have your new habit. But that in between, when you're kind of doing your new habit, sometimes doing your old habit, other times sort of catching yourself in it, it's a very frustrating passage of time, but it's how it goes. It's necessary.
I saw that you did a podcast with the BBC talking about aging and learning. So
Yeah.
I had a question about when it comes to singing, for example, how does the brain learn when there is also other developmental things going on? So like the pubertal voice, the growing voice, as well as aging, and there's different neurotransmitters happening. How does that all work? And do they connect?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, with kids, the kids are like sponges, right? People always say that, like kids just like absorb stuff. The child brain is able to learn much more easily because the sort of neurochemical soup that's in a child's brain is different than in an adult brain. And the whole entire job of children is to learn, right? It's a survival thing. And so it makes sense that kids would be able to like pick things up really, really easily. As we get older, that sort of neurochemical soup changes. And then we can't just like pick things up and just like know them the way that kids seem to be able to. As adults, we need to have focused attention. in order to be able to learn. A lot of times kids, like, I don't know, I'm sure you've witnessed like kids seeming like they're not paying attention to some, conversation or something on TV. And then like later they can just like rattle off everything that they just heard, in this nature program and they weren't even paying attention. It's like, what? How did you, whereas adults, like we wouldn't be able to do that probably, right? We'd actually have to like pay attention to it. And so, as adults, it's important to make sure that when we're practicing, that we are actually there and we're able to focus. And so, for instance, if you're absolutely exhausted and your mind is elsewhere, don't practice. It's not going to be a good use of your time, right? Don't practice mindlessly. A lot of people practice like in front of the TV or something like that, and they're not really paying attention. But we need to have that, sort of commitment and focus on what we're doing as adults, that kids can kind of, I mean, kids do better when they're focused too, but like they can get away with not doing that just because, what's going on in their brains is different.
So when as a teacher, when we're giving practice instruction, would you say that we would be better off considering the age of the person we're teaching?
Yeah, yes, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of research that shows sort of across the board, all people learn better when things are embedded in games, but that's especially true for kids. And so when I'm teaching kids, all of the sort of practice advice and practice methods that I give to adult students, I give that same information to kids, but it's embedded in a game. And so they don't feel like they're like practicing and that it's like a chore. It's a game that they're trying to get points or they're trying to win or they're trying to get a high score or something like that. And that helps them be much more engaged. It helps them want to practice more because it doesn't feel like this boring thing. It just feels fun.
You explain in one of your presentations on what musicians can learn about practicing from Current Brain Research Part 1, that the brain will dismantle pathways that haven't been used for a while. So this is probably another one of those how long is a piece of string questions, but how long does it take for a pathway that has seemingly been abandoned to be dismantled, or how long does it take for the brain to consider that to be no longer used?
That is a great question that I also don't have an answer to. And I don't know that anybody has an answer to that. Maybe they do, and I just don't know that research. But I think again, it probably depends on a whole host of things, right? But yeah, there is a mechanism in the brain that if you're using a pathway, one that hasn't been myelinated yet, is my understanding, that if you're using a pathway or not using a pathway, the brain notices and it sort of gets rid of it. We have limited space, right? We have a skull, and that sort of limits how large our brains can be. So our brains have to be really, really efficient, and they're not going to keep things around that we're not using. And so if a pathway started developing and then we stopped using it, the brain is going to notice that and sort of get rid of it and sort of reallocate those resources, if you want to use that kind of language. But in terms of how long that takes, I don't have a good answer for that.
No, that's okay. Earlier we were talking about physiologies and how we're all kind of made up of eyes and noses and mouths, but we all look different. Now, in my family, I have a nickname which is pea head, because I have a very small head. And sometimes it is a worry that inside there isn't much knocking about. So thinking about the size of heads and the brain that can go inside them, mainly because I want to feel better, Molly, if you can. Does size of head have any impact on the functioning of said brain?
No, absolutely not. There's been a lot of research on that. Absolutely not. No, no, no. And there has been a bunch of research on that, looking at like intelligence or whatever and head size, and they have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. In fact, to make you feel even better, there are some children, this is very rare, but some children who are only born with one hemisphere of their brain. So if you looked at a brain scan rather than like the brain with two hemispheres, like we were talking about, half of it would be empty and there would just be a brain on one side. And those children grow up and they are seemingly completely normal. Nobody has any idea that they only have like one half of their brain in there. And usually those cases are only discovered if the child like gets into an accident or some, like they need to have like an MRI on their head to to look at injuries, and then it's discovered, oh my God, like you only have half your brain. But nobody knew before that because there's no sort of meaningful impact on how they behave. If an adult got into a very serious accident and lost half their brain, yes, there would be very serious consequences to that. But our brains are so adaptable in terms of how they develop as children that you can be normal by like by anything anybody can observe and only have half your brain. And so with, it doesn't matter skull size with intelligence.
We're good to go with the P head.
Yes, there you go.
How much of this brain science do you think is important for the singer to understand and for the teacher to also understand and inform them of?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that as teachers, it's imperative that we understand how the brain works and how the brain learns optimally, because as teachers, we are helping our students learn. And if we don't understand the mechanisms by which learning happens, like we can't do that effectively. There's a great book called Neuroscience for Teachers that was written by two classroom teachers whose names are escaping me right now, essentially applying this science to like classroom teaching and how to organize a classroom and a curriculum. And they say in the preface, I'm going to be paraphrasing, but they say in the preface, if as a teacher you don't understand how the brain works, what are you even doing? And I read that, it was said a little more elegantly than that, but I was like, yeah, actually, that's like a really true statement. Like we as teachers are affecting our students' brains. We need to understand how the brains work. As students, I also think it's really important for students to understand how their brains work, because that can save a lot of frustration. What we were talking about with, if you feel like, oh, this thing is hard for me, therefore I can't do it. The whole idea of talent, I want to ban that word from the world because it only does damage. Calling a student talented is massively damaging. Calling a student, telling a student they have no talent is also massively damaging because it's irrelevant. You can get to an exceptionally high level at literally any skill you want to through practice. And when students understand that and they understand the mechanisms by which the brain changes when they practice, and they understand this sort of progress bar that we were talking about, and they understand how learning actually happens in the brain, it really empowers students to take control of their own learning, to not beat themselves up when they can't do something or something is hard for them because, like, of course, it's new. And so I think as teachers, we need to give that knowledge to our students as well, so that they are empowered in their own practice and their own learning.
Obviously, interest comes into it. I was never really interested in maths. I was never good at maths, but I could have been a mathematician.
You could have, right.
All of the opportunities that have been missed, not that I love what I do now, but all the opportunities that were there never seemed like they were opportunities, because they always seemed like, oh, well, I'm just not capable at that, or I wasn't very good at that.
Right. No, that's a great point. And like, you're right, interest is really important. We can't do everything in our lifetimes, right? We can't have every profession under the sun in our lifetimes. There's just not enough time. And everybody has things that they are naturally drawn to, right? That are more interesting to them than other things. And that's a really powerful thing that will drive practice, because, like, yes, practice can be frustrating, right? Especially when something isn't going well. It's your sort of internal drive to learn about that thing or do that thing that's going to keep you going through that difficult time. I will say, for me, people are always surprised by this, but there's a lot of things I'm interested in. There's a lot of things that come easily to me. Music was never, ever something that came easily to me. It's something I've always been interested in. Apparently, when I was 2, my mother took me to a children's concert at the local symphony that featured a violinist. I don't remember it right because I was too little. And I said, Mommy, what's that? And she's like, that's a violin. And I said, I want to play that. And she was like, okay, what do you know? You're 2. But I kept asking until she finally got me lessons when I was 7. So clearly this was something that I was very interested in for like my whole life, essentially. But it's not something that has ever come easily or naturally to me. And the only reason I'm a professional musician now is because I worked very hard to get here, not because it was something that sort of came came easily to me. There's many other things that I'm also interested in and have been interested in my life that came much more easily to me, but they weren't as interesting as music, right? And at a certain point, I had to make a choice. I did all sorts of things as a kid, sort of growing up, all sorts of different activities, but music was the one that like I really, really wanted to pursue. Could I have been a top level whatever in all these other things I left behind? Sure, I could have, and I had the interest, but I had to choose. And I sometimes think it's ironic that I chose the thing that came the least easily to me. But I think it serves as sort of a good lesson that it doesn't matter your initial skill level or how easily something comes to you. If you have the desire to do that thing, if you have the interest in that thing, then you can pursue it to the highest level you want. And if you don't have an interest in something, like that's fine too, right? I really don't care about math since you brought it up. Could I have been a mathematician? Sure, but I don't care about math. And so I wasn't going to, invest my time and effort into that because I didn't care.
When we're born, and you mentioned how you want to ban the word talent from the dictionary and ever being used ever again. When we're talking about like natural flair or natural ability, does that just physically come down to physiology? I mean, are we born, this might be a really silly question, but are we born with neural pathways that are kind of already there and waiting for us?
Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of development that happens in the womb, right? That, there's a lot of development that happens in the womb that continues for a long time, obviously, after we're born. And yeah, it's very hard to say. I don't know if there's a good sort of satisfying answer to this, like why are some people better at some things than others? It definitely has to do with nervous system wiring, the way our brains are wired, has to do with genetics for sure. But ultimately, in the end, it doesn't matter. Like, if something's easier for you and you have an interest in it, great. It's going to be quicker for you to get good at that thing. But if someone has an interest in something and it's very hard for them, it doesn't matter. They can still get very good at that thing. It's just going to be kind of a different timeline than someone else. And like I was saying, we all have things that are just easier for us than other things. And why that is, yeah, has to do with genetics, has to do with the way our brains develop when we're in the womb and once we are born. There's a lot of sort of randomness in how we develop, and that's sort of all living things, not just the nervous system. There is a lot of randomness that like one little event causes a slight change in how this thing develops. And, that's why we all look different. That's why like every leaf on the tree is different. That's why every snowflake is different. There's just sort of inherent variability in the world.
Molly, I'm loving this conversation. I'm really into it.
Me too.
And dear listener, if you are just as into it as we are, stick around for part 2 coming next week, where we'll be geeking out some more and digging deeper into those practice strategies.